Thank you all for coming today to participate in this important conference on terrorism, co-sponsored by the Ari Halberstam Memorial Fund. It has been an honor and privilege to share this day with you. But the one voice that was silent today was that of Ari Halberstam. On March 1st, 1994, my life as I had known it came to an end. My eldest son, Ari, was murdered in cold blood by Islamic extremists. I became a survivor on that day, and I can tell you, a mother's grief never ends. I can only remember him as he was the morning of the day he was murdered. A tall, blue-eyed, smiling teenager with every hope in the world and every reason to believe that his world would be a charmed life. Ari was a fifth-generation American teenager. He was 16 years old. He was funny. He was generous. He was outgoing. He was a star on the basketball court, 6 feet tall with huge funny feet that fit into a size 13 and a half sneaker. Ari would lead his team up. Would lead his team up the court as the final seconds were counting down. There would be 3 defenders on his back, yet he'd managed to sink the most beautiful fadeaway jump shot any of his friends had ever seen. But he wasn't just a jock. He was also a scholar and a modest boy of incorrigible faith. He was dedicated to his studies and devoted to his religion. He was the big brother par excellence, the oldest of my 5 children, a natural-born leader of the pack. And yet, it was his fate to become a statistic in the roster of murder, mayhem, and mutilation that is the goal of a global confederation of Islamic extremists who have no other purpose than to indiscriminately destroy the maximum number of innocent lives. For justice on behalf of my son, I decided it would become my mission to wake up America. If I didn't expose my son's case for what it was, I would be just the first of many, many mothers facing a similar horror in their lives. That I would not be the only mother to mourn over the body of her beautiful child. My other sons and daughters would not be the only siblings to miss their beloved older brother. Ours would not be the only community to suffer the loss of one of their children. It took 7 years of relentless digging, of endless correspondence, of persistent knocking on closed doors, of talking to deaf ears. I channeled all my energies to fighting terrorism by educating law enforcement officials at the local, city, state, and federal levels. And ultimately, I succeeded in getting my government to recognize that Ari's murder was part of a conspiracy against America, against freedom and democracy, and terrorism. Shockingly, the attack occurred almost a year to the day of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and nobody blinked an eye. And this was 6 years before 9/11, 6 years before the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center came crashing down. Had America's anti-terrorism machinery gone into action right then and there, it could well be that 9/11 would never have happened. And it could well be that so many terror attacks throughout the years would never have happened. It became clear to me that Ari was not just my child, he was every mother's child. Every mother who would lose a son or daughter to the merciless bullets or bombs of Islamic extremism. And as we know, there have since then been thousands of such mothers and fathers and brothers and children of the victims of terror in New York alone, not to mention Toulouse and Boston and Canada and London and Nigeria. Back then, I was virtually alone in recognizing that America's conspiracy of denial had resulted in a denial of conspiracy. But that was then. Which brings me to the greater and much broader issue on my agenda today. Because today is not only about Ari Halberstam's murder. This conference is about the lessons to be learned from Ari Halberstam's murder and how they affect our life today and the lives of our children in the future. Passivity is a recipe for disaster, and positive action is the best guarantee for our collective future. I want to be crystal clear. Today's conference is dedicated to saving lives and a matter of life and death. Understanding what terrorism is, knowing when an act of terrorism has been perpetrated, is the linchpin in preventing future and even greater acts of terror. As the late William Buckley wrote in the National Review, you can't make terrorism go away by pretending it doesn't exist. But of equal, if not greater importance, is that the world must understand that to tolerate any act of terror is to give a license to every act of terror. The moment the world turns a blind eye to a single act of terrorism, the moment it enters the murky water of moral relativism, the game is over. Terrorism becomes legitimate. Because at the end of every day, every group, every band of murderers has their justification and their sympathizers. Everyone has a grievance of one sort or another. But no grievance, no injustice can ever justify terrorism. No political or religious issue can ever legitimize the indiscriminate blowing up of innocent men, women, and children. And the moment any of us justifies terror anywhere, we become responsible for unleashing terror everywhere. And we are living the nightmare now. It doesn't take a global organization with Swiss bank accounts to perpetrate terror. It takes people who are willing to die in order to rob others of life. And I tell you, there are today thousands of people right here in America, men and women who listen to tapes by murderous preachers who obey their fatwas, who hate America, who do not wish us well, who would gladly die while murdering people like you and me. We must learn that there is no difference between an organization that is inspired by murderous religious teachings and individuals who are inspired by those same teachings. Then we will continue to attack the symptoms of the problem, not the source. Whether it is the Taliban in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden and his minions, fanatic madrasas in Pakistan, the Shia government of Iran, radical Wahhabist exports from Saudi Arabia and Yemen, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza and the West Bank, the radical imams of London and Leeds, ISIS in Iraq or Al-Qaeda cells. Their goal is nothing less than the destruction of Judeo-Christian civilization. They dream of a world united under the flag of radical Islam, a global theocracy that tolerates no other faith, no other moral code. They dream of a government that allows no freedom, no democracy, no free speech, no creative arts, no music of any kind, no rights for women, and no scientific inquiry. In their worldview, there is no room for compromise. They believe with absolute conviction that no price is too high to pay to achieve their goals. Human life means nothing to them, not even their own. They gladly sacrifice their own children by brainwashing them and sending them into crowds of people to commit mass murder. Ladies and gentlemen, it is far easier and more glamorous to track sophisticated organizations than it is to identify and head off the killers who are being dispatched by nefarious teachers. You who are in law enforcement are the front line in the defense of our great nation. You have your work cut out for you. Are we being proactive or reactive? It must be made clear that any act of terror here in America, government-sponsored or not, will result in decisive retribution. And immigration and customs enforcement must be empowered and motivated to deport without delay anyone who is involved in activities that undermine the security of United States citizens. But I can tell you this, If we want our way of life to continue, we must be ready to sacrifice our complacency. We must be ready to forego some of the conveniences that we have come to take for granted. We must learn to be constantly vigilant because the enemy can be anywhere and usually is. If we want our government to protect us, we must allow our government to protect us. Just as the face of terrorism is changing daily, we need additional legislation to allow law enforcement to effectively interdict any terrorist act on our homeland. We need to apply the lessons we have learned. We need to continue to collect intelligence and disseminate it. We need to continue to share information among our agencies. We need to monitor our prison systems where indoctrination and terrorist conversions are taking place. We need to use every loophole, every chance to close the loopholes that exist in exploiting our Constitution. And while the First Amendment must be upheld and protected, it does not include the right to cry fire in a crowded theater, or the right to call for the wanton murder of our citizens under the belief that a radical imam's exhortation supersedes American law. Unless we take the high ground and proudly claim that the values of freedom, democracy, creativity, self-expression, the rights of women, that these are inalienable and yes, superior, we will ultimately lose the battle. Of course, nothing can bring my Ari back. I choose to go on living because I share my son's faith in the Almighty. I continue to believe that God has not abandoned our world and that goodness and kindness will ultimately triumph over evil. Because every child is precious to me, I have chosen to lend meaning to my personal nightmare by doing whatever I can do to make sure it remains my nightmare. I don't want any other mother or father or child to live with what I must live with. Now I wish to leave you with a blessing and a request. My blessing is that none of you should ever know terror, that all freedom-loving nations should never again know of the horrors of wanton death and destruction. And my request is that you do your share to make sure it never happens again. Don't allow yourselves to become complacent. Never lose sight of the big picture because we are all part of it. And we can only protect ourselves if we face the truth boldly and honestly. We would do well to recall the words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Christian theologian and a member of the German parliament, who on the first day of Hitler's taking office said, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to stand is to stand." He was executed by the Nazis. All good people must stand up and speak out against the evils of terrorism. Silence in the face of terrorism is to condone it. If we do not educate each other about tolerance and diversity, about those virtues that are the polar opposite of terrorism, about acceptance and pluralism, we are implicitly approving terrorism and its message of hate and bigotry. God bless you all, and God bless America. And now I'd just like to say my thank yous. I have no words, Karen. This conference would never have been possible without, first of all, is David Kelly here? He didn't come back, huh? Okay. So without David Kelly's chairmanship, who you met this morning, without his leadership and his advice, and especially for his kindness and warmth and his efforts to keep Ari's memory alive. Now I'd like to thank our Fordham University and Director Karen Greenberg of the Center for National Security. Karen, for all the logistics involved, and for, I really see what went on here today. It's really amazing. Just very, very special. And the many long hours and efforts in putting this conference together. And so I have something for you that I'd like to share with you. So I need to open it up. have a new building.
Oh, that
So
is
let's
lovely.
take a picture. And what this is, it says, it's the Hebrew alphabet, and it says Osiot Machtimot, which means letters are wise, words are wise. It's about your life, it's about everything you do, and everything you've done, and certainly everything. So you can hang it in your new office in this beautiful brand new building. And I'd like to read what it says right here. Okay. In appreciation to Karen J. Greenberg, Center on National Security Fordham Law, today's terrorism, today's counterterrorism, in memory of Ari Halberstam, November 3rd, 2014. Can you take a picture with me? You guys did it, yes. Just need to say I know, I want to close, but I need to say thank you to one other person here. The success of this conference today is in no small measure to the support of the FBI, George Venizelos, the Utica, New York office, and his staff, who really spend a lot of time in helping us sending out the message. And David Raskin, Phil Horshkern, for doing Ari's case. And thank you. Have a good night.
We're almost done. I think I should make a few concluding remarks. Today has been a remarkable day. It's not every day that the director of the FBI decides to come and tell us what he thinks. And it's not every day that somebody like Peter Bergen gives the rendition he did about just what he thinks is going on or not going on in the world of terrorism. So you've had the full spectrum of what you can see. So let me end it with this. We're at a law school. We were at a law school at NYU, and we're at a law school at Fordham. And there's a reason. People always say, what are you doing in a law school? Why don't you go be in a public policy school? And I think Devorah's comments are why we're at a law school. Because the purpose of our courts and the purpose of our investigations and the purpose of our law enforcement work and our intelligence work that Director Comey started with today is to make sure that the pain and suffering of people who are victims gets addressed in a way that is not turned to violence. And it's where you don't have a court system you trust, or you don't have a court system, as in many countries around the world, that the kind of hurt of victims everywhere, and there are a lot of victims in this particular iteration of the war on terror, that the victims don't try to answer this themselves. And so it is in the hope that we can take so much of what's gone on all sides of this and try to put it through the systems that we trust and that we honor, and that at law school we call our judicial system. So that sort of explains to you the shape of the day. Thank you so much for staying all day. We'll see you next time.